particularly with the advent of theory and cultural studies, the homogeneity of the canon gave way to the heterogeneity of global diversity. The counter-narratives gave rise to post-canonical literature with growing cultural and linguistic diversity, representative of many human communities living in the developing countries and even the marginalized in the developed countries as well. In 2007, Nissim Nicholas Taleb wrote a book called The Black Swan. The title refers to an event with three attributes. The first is that the event is rare, occurring outside the realm of regular expectations. The second is that such an event carries an extreme impact. And the third is that the explanations about the occurrence can only be provided after the event. In other words, it's subject to retrospective explications. Many events in history may be cited as black swans: the world wars, the Holocaust, the partition of the Indian subcontinent, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the spread of the internet, the market crashes of 1987 and 2008, the attacks 9/11 and 26/11, and epidemics. Each one of these follow black swan dynamics. Each of these events were inconceivable before the dates of their occurrence, else they may have been avoided. From the list of black swans, there are two events in the 20th century that draw our attention because of the unprecedented humanitarian crisis they precipitated through bigotry and genocide. These are the Holocaust and the partition of the Indian subcontinent. At the end of World War II, a letter was found in a Nazi concentration camp addressing teachers. It read, "Dear teacher, I am a survivor of a concentration camp. My eyes saw what no man should witness: gas chambers built by learned engineers, children poisoned by educated physicians, infants killed by trained nurses, women and babies shot and burned by high school and college graduates. So I'm suspicious of education. My request is, help your students become human. Your efforts must never produce learned monsters, skilled psychopaths, and educated illiterates. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are important only if they serve to make our children more humane." This is the instrumental purpose of having selected Retrieving Memories of Partition for discussion today. Now, I'll first go through a set of key words which will be used during the course of my sharing these ideas. The first is Holocaust. This refers to a systematic state-sponsored genocide of European Jews, also gays, gypsies, and ethnicities, in Nazi concentration camps in World War II. Second, identity, a set of characteristics that define who you are. In the ordinary business of living, we have multiple identities. You may be an Indian, a Bihari, a Buddhist, or a follower of Hinduism or Islam by faith, or an atheist, a student in a college. You may like mangoes more than lychees, and you may be a closet poet who nurses a secret wish to rival Tagore someday. The miniaturizing of identity occurs at times of a crisis or a conflict, when your faith or caste or your nation can determine survival or death. This is what happened during partition. 3, nation. It is a socially constructed community of people imagined by that community to belong to a group which Benedict Anderson calls a broad horizontal comradeship. European nationalism, of course, is different from Asian and African nationalisms, which were born out of anti-colonial struggles. This is what Parsa Chatterjee has to say. 4, partition. Division of British India into 2 independent dominion states, India and Pakistan, according to the Mountbatten Plan. Now we come down to partition itself. The outcome of divisive politics can often result in history's shame. When Cyril Radcliffe drew the territorial borders, hurriedly partitioning the subcontinent, the mass exchange of population was accompanied by mobilized hate, unprecedented violence, and genocide, in which 1 million men, women, and children were killed, and 10 million were displaced from their homes. Conservative estimates of sexual violence comprising abduction and rape put the figure at 75,000 to 100,000. The mass migrations accounted for a total of 12 million in the East and West, and the West accounted for about 10 million. So while the two nations awoke to freedom, humanity died. This moment of history, its sheer horror, has been in choking rhythm, poetically expressed by Krishna Sokti in her 1979 work Zindagi Nama, which has been translated from Hindi by Tripti Jain. A time, a generation, one danger, fracturing, fragmentation, a tragedy which is not of one person, pain which is not only of one being, death also not of one, murder but not only of a single person. Corpses piled high. The Holocaust that happened has been swallowed up by time. Families and clans, sons and daughters, brides and grooms, all lost in the killings, in the massacres and stampedes, caravans that stretched over miles, trucks, trains, the shriek of engines piercing the slogans. The rail coaches are silent. Corpses have not only crossed over to countries, but have gone beyond life itself. This short excerpt provides a montage of how people from the same country, the same town, the same village could or can be divided by the politics of religious difference, and in the process lost or continue to lose their humanity. From a literary point of view, it poses complex questions about the adequacy of language to carry the burden and ability of the psyche to bear extreme trauma. I get down to discussing a few texts, and I've chosen Train to Pakistan because I suppose most people would have read this particular text. So since Train to Pakistan has become a classic for the sensitive treatment of the subject, refined by the entanglement of perplexity, paralysis caused by the enormity of circumstance, cowardice of contingency over the courage of morality. Inhabited mostly by Sikh farmers and their Muslim tenants, the rather anonymous village of Manomanjra has remained relatively untouched by the brewing violence in the past few months. Located close to the railway tracks with a bridge over River Sutlej, life in the village is temporarily governed by the arrival and departures of trains signaled by the whistle of the locomotives. Later, the whistle at irregular intervals and departures disrupts the customary habits and harmony to become ominous metaphors of terror. Identity in Manomanjra initially is related to plural affiliations to a location and occupation rather than faith. When the Western educated communist Iqbal with ambiguous religious identity arrives to stay in the local Gurdwara, he learns that despite class differences, Sikhs being landowners and Muslims being tenants, there is peace. The reckless Jagga, the protagonist of Singh's novel, amorously is engaged in the field with Nooran, and he says he's not a Sikh, nor is he a Muslim, nor a Hindu, he's a dacoit. Close to the changes to the quiet of Manomanjra are factored by three incidents: the killing of the Hindu moneylender Ramlal, the manipulated arrest of Jagga and Iqbal, and the arrival of an eastbound train that makes an unscheduled stop at Manomanjra with a carriage full of corpses that are hurriedly cremated. It establishes the major themes of identity and belonging, and by implication, how miniaturizing identity and the reductive solitariness can cause massive identity shifts following divisive politics. Now, these are real dangers in an uneven world. In his book, Identity and Violence, Amartya Sen argues that a great many persons' identities seem to give way quite suddenly to sectarian identification with Hindu, Muslim, or Sikh communities. The carnage that followed had much to do with elementary herd behavior by which people were made to discover their newly detected belligerent identities. A significant emotional charged section in the book is when the government decides to transport all the Muslim families from Manomanjra to Pakistan. The villagers are bewildered by the turn of events. A small joint army convoy containing one unit of Sikh soldiers and one of Pathans arrives in the village and orders Muslims to board within 10 minutes with the barest minimum of their meager belongings that they can physically carry. The Muslim officer orders the trucks to commence their journey to the transit camp in Chandannagar, from which the following night they would be transported by train to Pakistan. This scene is heartrending at many levels. The poverty in which the people live, the terrible uncertainty of their futures, and the eclipse of humanity. After the Muslims leave for their temporary refuge camp, a group of religious agitators comes to Manomanjra instigating people by naming Muslims as the enemy and enlisting the support of Malli's gang to plan genocide as Muslim leaves on their train to Pakistan. With the knowledge of the proposed mass murder on the train to Pakistan and his conscience racked by the knowledge that Hasina, his young entertainer, will also be on that train, Hukam Chand, the magistrate, plays his last card of contingency. He orders the release of Jagga and Iqbal with the flickering hope that one of them, because of the love of Nuran, or the other on account of ideological convictions, may thwart the genocide. Hukam Chand, catalyzed by alcohol and pragmatism, sinks into passivity for its ensured survival. Iqbal problematizes the issue with polemical distancing and takes refuge in alcohol. Jagga climbs the steel span of the bridge, across which a horizontal rope is tied just above the estimated funnel of the locomotive to cut through the bodies of those who are sitting on the roofs of the train. Now, during partition, these trains were absolutely filled to capacity with hundreds of people sitting on the roofs of this train. He's spotted by Malli, a dacoit turned champion of non-Muslim Manomanjra, and the attackers fire upon him, but he continues to cut that rope away with his kirpan. With a final volley of shots, when the engine is perilously close, Jagga cuts through the final strands, falls on the tracks as the train goes over him to Pakistan. In the pale moonlight, Jagga, with a flowing beard and white Pathani kurta, assumes the figure of a Christ on the rope, consumed with the intensity and desperation of his act of redemption. But unlike Christ, he does not cry out that he has been forsaken. It is the common Badmash Jagga's martyrdom which is the final intervention to redeem humanity from its own darkness. Knowing the history of partition is not enough. Literature resurrects humanity from the statistics to restore dignity to human beings by making space for the smallest individual voice to be heard. These are stories of their trauma, loss, and grief, as also of enduring friendships across borders, the courage and resilience with which they started to build their broken lives. In order to understand how partition impacted individuals and the mapping of multiple themes, I shall share with you a short story from the eastern border. It is a story called Father by Prafulla Roy. Roy came to India penniless from erstwhile East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, and this happened after partition. He traveled widely to experience the lives of struggling people, to extenuate his own suffering, spending time with the tribals in Nagaland, untouchables in Bihar, and ruthless people in the Andamans. The story entitled Father begins in early afternoon on a winter Sunday as the octogenarian Shekharnath Bandyopadhyay, racked by arthritis, settles to receive the warmth of the sun for his short siesta among his religious books and newspapers. We are told that he lives in a house called Shantinivas, and which is located on Abhay Haldar Road with his son Sandeep. Sandeep is an executive in a leading multinational company with his wife and children, Raja, who is a first-year English honors student at St. Xavier's, and Ruku, a student of class 11 in Calcutta Girls. Sandeep is sent to be Shekharnath's one and only son at that point in the text. Looking languidly across the road, he notices a taxi pull up and a middle-aged lady get out and ask bystanders for an address. His fading eyesight could barely make out that there was a passenger other than the driver of the taxi. Having located the address, this 50-year-old lady with the trappings of privilege rings the doorbell and asks if this was the home of Shekharnath Bandyopadhyay. She is welcomed into the house by Sandeep and his family, while Shekharnath in the balcony upstairs prays, "My God, let it not be her." An analepsis, which is a flashback, follows. Shekharnath, in his mid-30s, worked as a junior administrative officer in a jute mill owned by the Mackenzie brothers at Mirpur, then in East Pakistan, where his family had lived for 150 years, and this was the 7th generation. After partition, his wife Hemlata pleaded with him on several occasions to relocate to Calcutta among growing misgivings. Shekharnath did not see any reason to move to an unknown city when he trusted their magnanimous and empathetic neighbors. As time went by, things began to change. Mackenzie brothers sold the jute mill to a Dhaka industrialist. The surge of refugees from India filled the cities, and having lost all in their homes, were vengeful. Eventually, a riot erupted, and before the kindly neighbors could help, his house was gutted. Hemlata was burnt to death, and his daughter, Kuku, was abducted. Shekharnath and the boys, Sandeep and Sanjay, migrate to Calcutta, but Sanjay dies of a wrongly diagnosed disease a few years later. Back to the present, through a flurry of activity, Sandeep and his family have come excitedly to inform that Kuku has come home. Shekharnath bolts the door and refuses to respond. Kuku leaves in tears. When Shekharnath learns that Kuku has gone, he unbolts the door, and in the ensuing exchange learns that Kuku, after years, had been able to track Shekharnath's address through the Indian High Commission in Dhaka. She's been married to Harun, who was at that time, at the time of her abduction, a subdivisional officer who rescued her and sheltered her in his own house. He tried to find the whereabouts of her family for a long time, and unable to do so, married her for the sake of her respectability. He was now the joint secretary in the Ministry of Education in Bangladesh. They had a son, a daughter, a son who was a doctor, and two daughters who were still studying in college. Sandeep wonders if his father thought of his daughter committing suicide would be better than having had married Harun. Sandeep affirms her choice as most honorable and chastises his father for his intransigence as an octogenarian Orthodox Brahmin. Harun was the person waiting in the taxi to see how his wife would be received in her father's house. An agitated Shekharnath can hardly sleep, and waiting early knocks at Raja's door, asking his grandson to accompany him to the airport, having gathered that Kuku and Harun were to fly out to Dhaka early that morning. The meeting and emotionally choked reconciliation brings the story to a cathartic close. Several questions arise in the mind, and a number of comments are due. One, Of course, the story is very finely crafted, juxtaposing time and space to present the thematic concerns with clarity. 2, the emotional modulations bring out the multiple themes of loss and trauma, honor, shame, generational perceptions, rejection, and reconciliation. It has a happy ending, with a matrimonial bond of communal amity that satisfies conditions of middle-class respectability. Most partition stories do not have happy endings. The stories of Kamleshwar, Kitne Pakistan, How Many Pakistans, translated from English by Vishwamitra Adil and Alok Bhalla, Manto, Gulzar, Ravipar, Rajinder Singh Bedi's Lajwanti, Bhishm Sahani's The Train Has Reached Amritsar, Joginder Paul, The Sleepwalkers, Bapsi Titwa, The Ice Candy Man, Intizar Hussein's Basti, also the 2 works of Rushdie and Amitabh Ghosh. I found Father a little problematic because the reconciliation transforms communal difference into class commonality. How would Shekhar Nath have responded if Hupu, instead of having married a handsome Muslim civil servant, had married a Muslim mill worker or a peasant, however dignified the marriage might have been? As I've said earlier, the story satisfied the demands of middle-class respectability. However, Prafulla Roy probably looks at his work as an agency for healing the wounds of partition, while calibrating the thematic aspects in a manner that they're not only clearly recognizable, but also impact the consciousness of the reader. The intensity of the experience was so deep that possibly quantification and theorizing cannot provide a true modulation of the unfolding events. It remains possibly to rehumanize communal predicaments so wonderfully articulated by Kamleshwar. Under the rubric of cultural values, human beings can still succeed in their attempt to be compassionate toward one another. But the gods of man can never be won. We now turn to the outstanding work of Urvashi Butalia to uncover the layers of silence I wish to look at from the prism of Prafulla Roy's text. But before I do that, I wish to share some of the significant aspects of Butalia's remarkable work, The Other Side of Silence. Coming from a family of partition refugees, and having experienced the trauma, the events of the anti-Sikh pogroms of 1984, she tries to understand how cultural bonds over centuries with Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, having lived in relative peace and harmony, could suddenly change to blind hate and insanity as loot, arson, rape, and murder, and women being beheaded by their own family or jumping into wells to drown themselves to avoid dishonor. She reads violence, mass migration, refugeeism, rehabilitation in order to explore the human dimensions of history, the division of hearts. As Kamleshwar grievingly laments, "Oh God, you don't know how many Pakistans were created along the way with that one Pakistan. In how many hearts, in how many places. The creations of that one Pakistan solved nothing. It merely confused everything. Now nothing is at what it seems to be." Pakistan can be read from an Indian point of view as a metaphor for loss and separation. Remember, at the point of independence, Pakistan gained, India lost territory and people. So it is seen as an unfeeling space, a construction of otherness that has manufactured difference and hate with a murderous intent. It is true of international borders and borders within, among communities and peoples. And Kamleshwar again reiterates the division of hearts when his protagonist Mangal says, "Pakistan is everywhere. It inflicts wounds on you and me. It humiliates us. It defeats us every time. Partition, Butalia says, has been handed down to us, not only in texts and memories, but also in the reluctance to remember, to erase memories, and the reluctance to speak. This could be on account of the experience of trauma, as also one's complicity with every family having a history of being both victim as well as aggressor. As she journeys to collect personal histories of ordinary people, she discovers that even second and third generations have come to internalize otherness when their lives have had little direct connection with partition except through family or community memories. Feelings of fear and hatred seem to last obdurately beyond feelings of friendship and sharing. Interestingly, men and women remember things differently. The men more often than not engage in public narratives of events and happenings in the social or political sphere. For the women, it was the specifics of little narratives of felt loss and pain. While oral history is a contested terrain, it is also a methodological tool that to many feminist historians have been considerably empowering. History can be looked upon differently by juxtaposing women's narratives and testimonies alongside and against official discourses of history. The Constituent Assembly debates relating to the Abducted Persons Recovery and Restoration Act resonate with the claims of model upmanship, casting serious aspersions on the character of Pakistan while invoking the epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, to urge the government to act with determination, if not, to declare open war to recover the Sitas and Draupadis being held captive, staining national honor through acts of sexual violence or conversion. The discussions had little to do with women who were its subject. Partition gave a choice to its citizens to decide their nationality. The Abducted Women's Recovery Act took away this human right. An abducted Hindu or Sikh woman, irrespective of her choice, would be repatriated to India, while a Muslim woman discovered in India would be repatriated to Pakistan, often with tragic consequences. Those interested in this particular area can look up the story of Zainab and Bhuta Singh, which I'm not going into because of the shortage of time. And this is between page 127 and page 130 in Butalia's book. And so too with children. Specifically, what would happen to post-abduction children? Women's bodies are contested sites of culture. Its purity is mandatory for acceptance by patriarchal nationhood, by a community and the family. Reparations may be made by dehumanized, defeminized, feminized sublimation, as in Rajinder Singh Bedi's Lajwanti. Acts of purification after recovery through rituals and preferably martyrdom before the possibility of abduction, drawing upon the tradition of Jauhar, invoking valiant Padmini as a national icon. The defense of women lay in the hands of men as lawmakers of the patriarchal universe. While the migrations in the West were of a limited duration, the reciprocal flow of population continued in the East until after 1971. Hence, in Prafulla Roy's story, the unfolding tragedy takes place many years after partition. Following the same grammar of orthodoxy, Shekhar Nath prayed for the death of his daughter in order to rescind the shame on his family and his community. The latent order remains the same as the manifest order of actually killing to preserve honor and avoid shame. Shekhar Nath grieves for the loss of his wife who's burned to death. She was not abducted, or she did not go through the trauma of any form of sexual violence. Along with the images of gods and goddesses from Kali to Ganesh and Lakshmi in his room is the smiling photograph of his wife Hemlata. She died pure and therefore gains legitimacy for the acknowledgement of public grievability. There is no photograph of Pupu, no artifact of remembrance. She has been subjected to the erasure of memory and amnesia for the patriarchal self-defense for Shekarnath's failure to be Ram or Bhim. Why are the memories of partition important in our times? We inhabit a nation in which the division of hearts continues with the mobilization of hate and violence in the cynical pursuit of power. One of the most admired polymaths of our times, Ramchandra Guha, states, and I quote him, "A knowledge of history may make the Aam Admi more self-critical, less xenophobic. A knowledge of history is or should be the best antidote to hubris." To Ram Guha's educative value of history, I add literature. For in the reading of literature lies the possibility of engaging with many lives and circumstances other than our own and those we know. And in that, knowledge can begin to understand the imagined other. This is its ethical principle. The critical reading of literature enables us to resist the many gods that inhabit our world, and in challenging them, express our humanity. It may be our only way to extend the human lease on planet Earth. Thank you for your patience.
Hello, am I audible again?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. It was a really nice first session. Sir, the first question that we have got is, how does the novel Train to Pakistan represent specific religious belief practice in such? Does the novel suggest that Muslim, Hindu and Sikh are exclusively religious designations, or is there more to membership in these groups than just religious belief?
Well, religion is a larger part of the spectrum of culture. So, there is that intersectionality which is absolutely undeniable. But as it happens in Manomanjra, where the action of Train to Pakistan is set, if you remember, I've said already that most people, their identities were directly associated with their location and their professions. So if the Muslims were tenants, they tilled the fields. The Sikhs were landlords, so they were privileged in the community. But if you observe the differences in terms of religion or even culture is not even suggested. It comes much later on, and comes later on particularly when the eastbound train comes with, the whole train is filled with corpses which are hurriedly cremated. So that is when the trouble begins, and that is exactly where mobilization also begins. Because what one notices in the case of most kinds of mobilization of collective hate is that individuals by themselves, there is so much which is being done in terms of memory theories and memory studies in the last 10 years. And it is related to the whole idea of individuals in dialogue with collective memories. And when a people sort of come together, the dynamics of togetherness can create a situation which often goes out of control and into very violent modes. So that is precisely what happens in train to Pakistan. It is mobilized. It is actually manufactured. Of course, the catalyst is there, but the catalyst leads to a mobilization. Mobilization of hate, mobilization of otherness, naming of the enemy, and finally, the desire for extermination of the enemy. I hope I have answered that.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Now, another question. It is from Dr. Umesh Patra, who is also a speaker tomorrow from Central University of North Bihar, Mahatma Gandhi Central University of Bihar. So his question is, does Jagga, a dacoit in train to Pakistan, who saves lives for his beloved, stand as a symbol of individual action when state fails as an authority to ensure security? So,
well, at that point of time, I don't think there was anything such as a state, because we are looking at a period of transition. The British were in a hurry to get out, and the two governments on either side of the border were hardly equipped to negotiate, spread violence of that kind. So virtually there was very little by way of state. Yes, there locally things could possibly have been managed, but this is what happens in terms of bureaucratic control everywhere, right through times. Unless there is a crisis, people don't act. The crisis could possibly have been avoided earlier had Hukum Chand not made the initial mistakes, which were, of course, they're not mistakes, they were manipulations, in terms of the arrest of Jagga as well as the communist Iqbal. So that was the first mistake that he makes. Then the whole idea of giving any kind, remember, Malli is a dacoit. Now, if a dacoit is given the respectability of a defender, quite obviously we are going to have, the kind of violence that can spiral with very little ability to control. Yes, Jagga is somebody who, of course, has been a petty criminal. There is little doubt about it. As a matter of fact, Malli wanted him to join his gang. He refuses, and a lot of bangles is thrown into his house, which is, of course, a very, very patriarchal metaphor again, because Jagga is seen to be a feminized individual. But yes, so it is Jagga who eventually does redeem, shall we say, humanity by that particular act. Of course, he knows Nuran is on the train, but at the end of it, his action not only saves Nuran, but thousands of others who are on board that nightmarish journey.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Sir, we have got another question. This is Yasmin from West Bengal. And she says she thanks you for this lecture and says that it's wonderful. And then, then she says that people tend to hold on to fictional mythology strongly, but people are reluctant to remember authentic historical events of genocide and violence. The memory keeps fading away even when we talk of post-memory. Why does it happen so? Her question is that.
Well, I think to a large extent, history is statistical. It's merely a narration of events. And again, the kind of history that we read, there are carefully edited, and history is written usually from certain ideological positions as well. Well, so too with literature, there is little doubt about it. But what literature does is to add the fourth dimension. And that fourth dimension is something where the walls are broken down completely. And when those walls are broken down, it gives us that ability to imagine the other. And therefore, what we gather is that literature becomes absolutely significant because it adds a soul to the events rather than looking at history as merely, shall we say, a compilation of data. It is something that makes life and history humane. And that, I think, is the singular plus point of literary studies. And along with that, of course, is critical intelligence, which I spoke about, so that quite obviously we can express our humanity. It is very, very clear. You know, when one has to make a choice between love and hate, for instance, and I'm sorry to be talking in binaries, but, you know, the choices are very clear. And I think literature enables us to make those choices.
I guess we can take one more question.
Sure.
Okay, sir. So this is Shataki from BRA, Bihar University. So his question is that the typical caste and class mentality that you talked about in the story Father, this is what we are facing till date along with patriarchy. But
Yes.
when we look up to the upper class rich people, they hardly follow it. What do you say about it? This is
Are you implying that the wealthy, you know, the families of the wealthy, patriarchy doesn't play a role?
that won't be so.
Or for that matter, caste doesn't play a role?
Yeah.
I mean, I know, for example, very few wealthy families, and I know a few of them, who would never marry their daughter into another caste, for example.
And also there is a lack of
What about,
recognition.
Sorry?
There is a lack of recognition. Like there is a denial that you follow it.
Absolutely, it's a complete denial. No, it continues, and it is likely to continue as well. And you know, I have this theory. I mean, I don't know how far I'm right, but as long as India does not have social security, this whole idea of caste and community is likely to continue. For the simple reason, suppose there is a member of one particular caste or one particular community, and that person has a health problem, or a legal problem, or an a brush with the administration. Where does that person go? When we know, for example, that our public health institutions are not what they ought to be, our political leadership is not what it ought to be. Shall we say our legal, our entire legal system is fraught with so much of red tape. So where does that person go? In the absence of a corruption-free society and, shall we say, the absence of social security. In a system that does not work, one has to use one's contacts. So the person goes to members of the family. If they can't tackle that, where do you go to? You go to the members of your caste and see if you can contact somebody of the same caste and get your work done. So until we have social security in this country, it is rather unlikely that these will go away.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this enriching session.
From BHU has a question for you. He says that, don't you think that the counter narrative which is set by literature is by and large is backed up by contemporary scenario of politics?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
Hello?
Yes.
So I think the crux of the question is, crux of the question is something like that counter narrative. Do you think that the counter narrative which is set up by literature is somehow backed by politics? I mean, there is this political angle between counter narrative strategies in literature.
Of course, it's backed by politics. There is nothing outside politics. Absolutely so.
Exactly.
If mainstream politics if the dominant narrative is backed by mainstream politics, quite obviously the counter narrative will be backed by peripheral politics, the politics of the marginalized. because any resistance is political. I completely agree, it is. Do so.
Okay,
And
sir.
thank you so much for your patience, and thank you for having me on this program.
So this is our pleasure, please, sir. This is our pleasure.
Gopal Kumar Chaudhary